Good morning and welcome to Thrive, Not Just Survive. Today is Friday, and I am so grateful that you have all joined me this week in terms of the different things that we've talked about. I want to continue the conversation today with Dr. Bryantbruce regarding Black Lives Matter, social equities, just basic equality for all. And we want to continue the conversation because the importance of this whole idea of not just being distracted by things that are going on in the news media or just around us, when things, become other things become the highlight of news, we tend to kind of forget the traction that we are trying to keep up with in terms of this really important aspect of humanity. And so today, I want to continue this conversation with Dr. Bryantbruce so that we don't lose the traction, so that we can continue, so that you can all participate in the conversation and carry it forward. So let me bring Dr. Bryantbruce on as we continue this conversation on this beautiful Friday. Hey, Cheryl, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. And I'm so glad that, we get our time on Fridays to continue the conversation so that we can do our part in keeping this topic at front of people's minds, and the conversations that we're having can be impactful. So I want you to just share with me sort of what's going on from your perspective on the whole idea of Black Lives Matter. And I think I'd like you to share a little bit more in terms of what they're doing, what they're standing for, and the different things that we should be aware of.
Okay, so I'm going to just read to you from Wikipedia what it is that the organization is purporting to stand for. Because as we discussed last week, although the Black Lives Matter movement is significant in terms of a lot of the things that it's calling for, and on the surface, it is promoting the interest of Blacks, one has to take into consideration the sources behind the movement, and one has to look a little bit more closely at what the movement is doing. One of the examples that I'd like to use is that we always talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, and Abraham Lincoln is touted as a hero for African Americans in terms of having freed the slaves. That would lend you to think that Abraham Lincoln was pro-Black and against slavery, when in actuality, that was an economic power struggle between the North and the South. And it had nothing to do with Abraham Lincoln's love for Black people or the fact that he detested slavery. Interestingly enough, a lot of the people who were on the side of fighting against slavery and abolishing it actually owned slaves and continued to own them even after the emancipation. So once the Emancipation Proclamation was delivered and slaves were declared free, it still took a while for slavery to end. So I want people to be clear on what's going on with the Black Lives Matter movement. What the Black Lives Matter platform is calling for, it has 6 demands, and it actually, we think about Black Lives Matter starting right now with these events, but it did not. It actually started back in 2013. So this is not a brand new movement, as a lot of people seem to think. What they're demanding, number one, is to end the war on Black people. Number 2 is reparations for past and continuing harms. Number 3 is divestment from the institutions that criminalize, cage, and harm Black people, and investment in the education, health, and safety of Black people. Number four, economic justice for all and a reconstruction of the economy to ensure our communities have collective ownership, not merely access. Number five, community control of the laws, institutions, and policies that most impact us. Number six is independent Black political power and Black self determination in all areas of society. Now, on the face of things, one would listen to these six demands and would say, well, that's absolutely spot on. These are things that need to occur. And we are certainly in support of those occurring. The arguments begin, though, when you start to actually look at the organization a lot further. And when you look at who it is that is founding and funding and who's pushing this organization, then you have to ask the questions, what is the underlying agenda? And that's where the African American population is starting to get twitchy, because this organization, although it's being touted as a grassroots organization, and people think of it as Black created, Black run organization to fight against racism, that it is not. And we see that actually as we see the protesting going on, because when you watch the protesting on television, one of the things that has immediately come to the attention of most people is that most of the people out there protesting are not African American. They're not Black. They're not people of highly melanated skin. Most of the people out there protesting are young whites. And most of the people out there protesting, once one looks at the group, they fall into two categories. You have a group of young people, and this is the same group of young people that came in as the quote occupiers back some years ago and were occupying cities like Oakland, which is the primary city that I live in, and is considered one of the Black cities because there's a fairly high African American population. And so the occupiers came into to Oakland, and they had an entire agenda. And we saw the same things happening. We saw the protest, and we saw the instigation of rioting. The occupiers, again, were predominantly young white kids. And when you actually looked at them and spoke to them about the Occupy movement, most of them were not political at all. Most of them had no clue what they were really doing out there. A lot of them were kids that were already, they had run away or they were already disenfranchised. A lot of them actually came from good, solid homes with money. And so, even amongst this young group, one of the one of the things that we saw as a common thread is that these were young white kids who came from money. Then, when you look at Black Lives Matter, um, it's important to know that the Black Lives Matter movement is actually created by a group of wealthy white individuals, mainly, wealthy white males, and that corporate media is very much involved in it. And I mean, we all see that the media is driving this movement. That being said, it is important. It is an important movement for the benefit of the Black population. The fact that the level of awareness was raised uh, by these people is significant, and it will significantly promote change. But we do have to understand that that change is, there are underlying reasons for it. And my sense, to a certain extent, is that we're really talking again about money. The war between the North and the South was about money. This is going to be a war about money. Although Black people are a fairly small percentage of the population, Black people actually spend a fairly large amount of money within the United States. And there is an increasing awareness of this. There is some manipulation going on here. And one of the things that I want you to think about as you're looking at the Black Lives Matter movement, the poster child for Black Lives Matter is Floyd, George Floyd. Now, people are being killed every single day. Black Americans are being killed every single day. And, some of them are college students, some of them are professionals, some of them are children. These are not the ones that were latched onto by the Black Lives Matter movement. Certainly, what was done to George Floyd was heinous, and especially in the extent of the amount of time that it lasted. But equally heinous things are being done to other people, to other African Americans on a daily basis. What is different about George Floyd, and why some of the pushback from the Black community about the selection of George Floyd by this movement as the poster child, is that it actually gives the white population something to push back against. When their sensibilities are offended by the fact that in order to accept the Black Lives Matter movement, to a certain extent, many of them have to admit to their own racism. And that's a sensitive subject, and it elicits a defensive posture in a lot of people. The easy pushback is George Floyd, because typically in the United States, Blacks have been pictured in a negative light. We've been pictured as criminals. We have been pictured. Women are pictured as being over sexualized. Men as well. We're pictured as aggressive. You have the black male that walks down the street, and white people have to run to the other side. You have the image of the angry black woman. This is how we're depicted. And using George Floyd as the face of this movement kind of falls into that, because George Floyd was not the black football hero that was on his way to college. George Floyd was not the soldier that came back home and was killed by fellow white soldiers because he had a white girlfriend. George Floyd was not the innocent child that was killed by police accidentally as they were trying for somebody else, or some mother's innocent young man, who's 12 or 13 years old that police, quote, thought was a robbery suspect. These are not the people that were selected as the face of this movement. The person selected as the face of the movement, and I'm not minimizing the fact that what was done to him was awful and unacceptable, and who he was had nothing to do with his right to life. But George Floyd was a criminal. He was a criminal. And, by any stretch of the imagination, George Floyd was not going to be painted out as the pillar of society, an altar boy kind of person. So one has to think of it as very, very interesting that this is the person that they selected to get behind as the poster child for this Black Lives Matters movement. And so the African American community is starting to think about that and ask, with all of these lives that are being lost, and many of them valuable members of the community, one has to ask why this one. So incensed this movement that is basically a white organized, white funded movement.
So I just want to kind of, I'm trying to understand it, right? So they've been in existence since 2013, and George Floyd just passed away or was killed a couple of months ago. So there
Yes.
has been, over the years of their existence and the movement, has there been other, um, you know, poster childs, as you call them? Has there been anything else that the Black movement or the Black Lives Matter, have they highlighted other things that are going on in the communities?
Um, they have, but not to such a great extent. I mean, it's been fairly well a quiet movement, and I became aware of it probably around 2013, 2014. And what we would see is small groups of whites standing on street corners with signs that said Black Lives Matter. And they were protesting certain things.
So do you think that, even though right now this is very a tenuous situation, and George Floyd's killing has now given this movement more sort of exposure, that this is such a serious matter? I understand that, there are other people being killed, even those that, I mean, that don't have a criminal record, but just innocent lives. Everybody has the right of life, no matter what. If was a criminal, then that should have been tried in that forum of whatever those injustices or whatever he created for himself, the challenges of crime and all of that. But I'm just sort of kind of getting an understanding of, is this something that's helped create further awareness that this is such a huge issue that we're dealing with?
Um, it is something that does create further awareness, and it is a huge issue that we're dealing with, and it is significant and important that we deal with it. But I think what African Americans are looking at right now is, what is the underlying agenda, and what is going to be the pushback for this. Because again, I'm going to go back to what happened with the Emancipation Proclamation and such. On the surface, the freeing of the slaves was a good thing. On the surface, it appeared that African Americans were going to get the things that we're fighting for right now. And certainly we have made some, advances. We've made some huge advances. So the Emancipation Proclamation was a good thing, but you still have to understand underlying purposes were not for the benefit of blacks. The underlying purposes were economical for the benefits of whites.
So
And
this is where
politically,
I'm just kind of understanding, right? That even though, yes, and I haven't studied it enough to know a lot, but there are underlying agendas to all the different platforms that are out there, right? But
mhm,
is some sort of start to the change, to
mhm.
having that be the first step or the second step in terms of creating some sort of equality. I'm just sort of trying to understand that by addressing those underlying issues, are we losing sight of the fact that this is what's going to help us move forward?
No, I don't think so. Because I think that we still have to address those issues. I think that it's still very important to address those issues, but we have to look at that in the context of, are these distractors from other bigger issues? When we have over here, quote, addressing these issues, are we failing to look at the underlying issues that put the African American community where it is? When, all of the attention is being pulled towards the white racism of the police. Now, the good thing about that is that it is causing everybody to address their own issues in terms of discrimination. So that's a good thing. But when we pull all of the attention and we point all of the fingers at the white police being the underlying issue for racism in America, and we say if we defund the police departments and we're going to reform the police, which that is something that needs to be done. If we do this, this is going to fix the black community. It's a gross oversimplification, because when you look at it, we talk about police brutality against blacks. But when you actually look at the numbers, everybody's acting like this is a new thing that's just unrolled, in the last uh, year or the last few years, even. But the numbers of blacks being killed, when you actually look at it, has not increased. The number of blacks hitting the media has increased. And this is what's got the media attention. But those numbers are fairly small in terms of deaths in the black community. And black on black crime is very, very high. To elevate the black community, you definitely have to address these issues that Black Lives Matters has targeted. But even more importantly, you have to look at issues that are occurring in the black community. And if you look at those issues in terms of racism, those issues become much greater. When you look at issues of things like what happened with Black Wall Street, then issues become more clear. Because what has happened traditionally in the past, blacks have controlled great wealth. And they have used that wealth to build up communities, fully functional communities that were doing very positive things and where people were living very normal lives, where people were living the American dream. But as soon as Black wealth became too great, and as soon as the perception of them being too powerful, not controllable, came about, the Black community has been systematically destroyed each time. And yet it has continued, because it is strong, it has continued rebuilding. And each time it's rebuilt stronger. And as wealth accumulates again, then it's shut down. And the last shutting down of the Black community came with the introduction of drugs into the Black community. The last shutting down of the Black community came with the removal of Black men from the Black community. Was a blatant attempt to break the Black family, to break the strength of the Black community. And it was a tactic that has been used since the slaves were brought to the United States. One of the first things that would happen when the slaves were brought here, families would be separated. They would be sent to separate plantations. And the prisons are the new plantations when you take into consideration that most of the people that are in the prison are not in the prisons because they've created horrible, heinous crimes. Most of the African Americans in prison today are there on petty drug related crimes. And when you take into consideration that marijuana has been legalized, one would think that if marijuana is legal, all of these people who are sitting in jail for these marijuana related charges would be able to clear the jails, but they are not. And they are still serving inordinately long sentences. And then when they do come out, they're coming out with criminal records that make it difficult for them to move on in society in a productive way. They're coming out having been institutionalized, where they have a lot of them been broken, or where a lot of them have been in with hardened criminals, and now they're not functioning well in society. So one has to look at all of these sorts of underlying things. It's a much more complex problem than Black Lives is leading us to believe. So what Black Lives Matter is doing is important, and we certainly have to stay on top of that. But what I'm seeing the pushback be is that Black people are starting to step back and say, wait, this is a significantly more complex issue. And although we appreciate what Black Lives is doing in terms of the gains that it is helping us to make, and we have to push for that, we also have to look at it critically and make sure that we understand what's going on and that the game being played continues to be a positive game, and that it continues to be something that is working in our favor, and that we are not just pawns in a political agenda that could end up imploding in our face, and that could end up with incredible backlash, which is what we're already starting to see. And I mean, when President Obama went into office, one of the things that I made the point of was, as happy as I was to see him there, this country was not ready for an African American president. And I had said from the beginning that there was going to be horrific pushback, that blacks were going to pay the price for that with pushback. And we indeed did see that. And we got to watch him disrespected on a regular basis. Um, and now the man is out of office, has been out of office for years, and yet he is blamed for everything by the white establishment. Trump blames Obama for every single thing that ever happened in the White House, things that, happened before he was in, things that are happening since he's been out that he's got nothing to do with. He's blamed for everything. See, the black man caused the issue. And, we get the pushback from whites who felt like we never should have been there in the first place. And we're we're bound and are already starting to get pushback for this Black Lives Matters movement. And we've talked about that has been a concern of mine, all along, that as this progressed, that we would start to see more pushback. So I think that is the point, that we have to continue to be vigilant on this issue and make sure that, again, blacks aren't used as pawns, and that this thing doesn't flip flop against us in the same way that affirmative action was flipped around by the Alan Bakke decision, and the term reverse discrimination came into play, and everything that was brought about by the affirmative action programs that were set to balance things out was reversed and taken away. And even with the affirmative action, as opposed to it being something to help blacks, it was perceived as an unearned handout. And there was a lot of anger directed at the black community because of it. So we have to be aware of these things.
And I think that's the key, right? Is the awareness, and then also looking beyond what we're seeing in the surface. Now we've reached our 30 minutes, and this is such a huge conversation, and that's why we're continuing it every Friday, so we can kind of take bite-sized pieces to be able to kind of digest it, think about it, and really look deeper than perhaps what we see on the surface. And so with that, I want to thank you for sort of the deeper insight this week in kind of thinking beyond just those words of Black Lives Matter, because just that statement says a lot, that yes, Black Lives Matter, but what is the agendas? What are the underlying things that are going on that potentially could backfire, or potentially, like you said, could put Black lives as pawns, and in serving a different agenda. And we want to make sure that all of this sort of is coming to light for the good of the African Americans, for the good of everybody to be equal, and for people to realize that every life, Black life, has purpose and has meaning and has a value, that we need to really address from that standpoint of, hopefully without agenda, that it is basically that we're going to create a world that is even playing field for everybody, where we can jointly live together in harmony. So I want to really thank you. Like today, I got a lot out of what you said. I was very quiet because I think I was taking it all in. I think we've addressed it from a different angle today. So for those that are watching, I want to encourage people to really start asking more questions, peel back the onion in terms of what you're seeing and what's underneath it. So thank you, Cheryl, for a wonderful call, a very insightful call. I'll see you next week for sure, and we'll continue the conversation.
Yes, indeed. And next week we will talk about Representative Alexandria Ochoa Cortez, AOC, and the battle that she's having with Washington, D.C., the battle that she's having for women and other underrepresented minority groups.
That's brilliant. I think these types of conversations about other, like you say, unrepresented or minority groups or whatever they're, I think is part of the news. This is something that is, again, back into our awareness. We need to make sure that we're aware of it. We need to know why and what's going on, rather than playing, like, I don't see it, I don't know it, therefore I'm not involved kind of attitude. So thank you again. Happy Friday to you. I'm going to see you next week. Have a great weekend.
Okay, you as well, Nasira. Love you.
Thank you. Love you too, Cheryl. So this was a very deep conversation, and I hope what you, if you're listening on replay or if you were joining me live, really look at things from a different perspective, that there is a thing that media shows us, and that's well and fair. They are reporting on certain issues and certain things that are, forefront. But we do need to look beyond that, and we need to start asking more questions and becoming more aware of different agendas. What's going on behind the scenes, and is this the right place to be or the right movement to be on? And if there's certain things that we need to speak out against, then we should use the platform to be able to bring more awareness. So happy Friday. I know this was a deep conversation, and I hope that you'll walk away with some things to think about. I will be back on Monday with another guest. I want you to have a wonderful weekend. Whatever you're doing, be safe, be happy, be blessed. Remember to be kind to yourself and others. I'll see you on Monday. Happy weekend.